Sophie and I had always been the perfect couple, or so I thought. We had been married for 5 years, and everything seemed to be in place. The house, the career, the occasional dinner with friends, it all felt right. Yet, something was changing. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I felt it. A shift, a distance between us that wasn't there before. Sophie had always been the center of my world. She was beautiful, confident, and full of life. Her smile could light up a room, and her touch had always been electric. But lately, something was off. She was distracted, her eyes often distant, her smile forced. There were late nights at work, phone calls she wouldn't let me overhear, and the smallest of gestures that made me wonder if something was happening behind my back. One evening, I came home early. Sophie had left a note saying she'd be out for a work meeting, something that had become all too frequent. But this time, I felt an unsettling need to know more. I told myself it was nothing, that I was overthinking it, but the feeling gnawed at me, urging me to take action. I wasn't planning on following her. I didn't want to believe I was becoming paranoid, but there was something in the air, something in the way Sophie had been acting recently that made me question everything. So I did something I never thought I would, something I regretted from the moment I did it. I followed her. I parked a block away from the restaurant she had mentioned. It was a small, upscale place, quiet, intimate. Sophie didn't usually go to this part of town, but tonight she had. I watched her enter, dressed in a black dress that clung to her figure in a way that made my pulse race. She had always looked stunning, but tonight she looked different. There was something about her posture, something in the way she held herself that made me uneasy. I stayed in my car, watching from a distance. She didn't seem to notice me. She walked in confidently, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I waited for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding in my chest. Then the door opened, and there he was, a man I had never seen before. Tall, handsome, dressed sharply. Sophie greeted him with a smile that made my stomach twist. They embraced. But it wasn't just a friendly hug. There was something intimate in it, something familiar. My stomach churned as I watched them exchange words, their closeness palpable, their body language suggesting something more than just business. I stayed hidden, my hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. I couldn't breathe. The truth was starting to settle in. My mind raced, but all I could think was, is she having an affair? The following days felt like a nightmare. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. The images of Sophie with that man haunted me, and the more I thought about it, the more the suspicion grew. There were more lies. The late nights at work, the sudden trips she was taking, the distance between us. I confronted her several times, but she always had an excuse ready. "It's just work," she'd say. "I'm just tired, that's all." But I knew the truth now. I couldn't ignore it. Sophie was hiding something. Someone. I had to know more. I had to find out the truth. That evening, I did something even more reckless. While she was taking a shower, I searched through her things. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I knew I had to find something. A phone number, a message, anything that would confirm what I already suspected. I found it in the back of her drawer. A note. "Meet me at the usual spot. Don't keep me waiting." The words burned into my brain. My heart pounded and I couldn't breathe. Sophie had been seeing him. The man from the restaurant. She had been lying to me for months, and now I had the proof. I waited for Sophie to return from her meeting that night, my mind racing, my thoughts scattered. She came in, just like usual, cheerful, unaware, but I knew the truth now. I couldn't look at her the same way. I couldn't pretend everything was fine. The silence between us felt like a ticking bomb. She noticed the change in my demeanor immediately. Her smile faltered, and her eyes darted around nervously. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice high-pitched. She knew something was off, but she didn't know how much I knew. I didn't answer. I just handed her the note. She froze. Her face drained of color as she stared at the paper in my hand. "Where did you find this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Does it matter?" I shot back. "What matters is that you've been lying to me. You've been seeing him, haven't you?" Her silence was deafening. Her eyes, wide with shock, told me everything I needed to know. "It's not what you think," she whispered, her voice shaky. "I never wanted you to find out like this." "Then what is it, Sophie?" I demanded, stepping closer to her. "What is going on?" Tears welled in her eyes. I didn't mean for it to happen. It just did." She looked down, her voice breaking. I thought I could keep it a secret. I never wanted to hurt you." The truth felt like a punch to the gut. My wife, the woman I trusted with my entire life, had been having an affair. And the worst part, I had been blind to it, to everything she was doing behind my back. "I loved you," she said, her voice cracking. "But I don't know what happened. I lost myself, and now I don't know how to fix it." I stood there, my hands clenched into fists, trying to hold back the rage, the betrayal. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shout, to accuse her of everything she had done. But in that moment, I didn't know who I was anymore. That night, I couldn't sleep. The darkness of the apartment felt suffocating, like a heavy weight pressing down on me. Sophie had confessed, but the pain was still unbearable. How could I ever trust her again? How could I ever look at her the same way after everything? But there was one question that kept me up, one question I couldn't ignore. Who was he, the man she had been seeing, the man who had taken my place? I decided that night that I would find out. I would confront him, just as I had confronted her. I couldn't leave it like this. I needed to know who he was and why he had taken my wife away from me. After that night, everything changed between Sophie and me. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, with guilt, and with a simmering desire to both fix things and break them apart. I wasn't sure what I wanted, or even if I wanted to salvage what was left of our marriage, but there was something undeniable between us, something still burning beneath the surface. Sophie had apologized countless times, but apologies never seemed to be enough. And yet, when she looked at me, when her eyes locked with mine, there was something else. A softness, a vulnerability, and maybe even a trace of longing. It was the same longing I had once seen in her, but now it was mixed with something darker, something I couldn't quite grasp. One evening, she came to me. We hadn't really touched since everything had fallen apart. No gentle hand on the shoulder, no comforting embrace. But now, as she stood in front of me, her lips parted slightly, her eyes filled with that uncertainty, I felt the pull again. The warmth of her presence, the way her fingers lightly brushed mine. She was standing so close now, and I felt the air between us electrified with tension. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I never wanted to hurt you. I never meant for any of this to happen." I could feel my chest tightening. The betrayal was still there, raw and painful, but there was also something else, something I couldn't deny. The attraction, the love, the years of intimacy between us hadn't disappeared overnight. They were still there, buried deep beneath the hurt. Without thinking, I reached for her. My hands moved slowly, almost cautiously, as if unsure of where I stood in her life now. But she didn't pull away. She welcomed me, her hands finding their way to my chest, her fingertips brushing the fabric of my shirt. And that simple touch, gentle, tentative, sent a shock through me, waking something deep inside that I thought had died. She leaned in, her breath warm against my ear. "I still love you," she murmured. "I never stopped." And then, before I could say anything, her lips were on mine. It was soft at first, tentative, as if both of us were testing the waters, unsure if we were ready to wade back into the depth of emotions we had once shared. But the kiss deepened quickly. Her hands slid up to the back of my neck, pulling me closer, and my arms wrapped around her waist, drawing her in as though I couldn't breathe without her. There was something intoxicating about the way we kissed, something that made me forget about the betrayal, forget about the pain. All I could focus on was the warmth of her skin, the softness of her lips, and the way her body seemed to fit against mine, as if we were meant to be this way. As we broke the kiss, our foreheads touched, both of us breathing heavily. I could feel her heart beating against mine. "We can't just pretend like nothing happened," I said, my voice low and uncertain. "I know," she whispered, her hands trailing down my chest. "But I want to try. I need to make things right, even if it means taking it one step at a time." The following days were a whirlwind. Sophie and I spoke more openly than we had in months. The emotional distance between us was still there, but the physical closeness was undeniable. Every touch, every glance seemed to bring us closer together, but also reminded us of what had been broken. One night, after a long talk, Sophie took my hand and led me to the bedroom. There was an urgency to her touch, but also a hesitation, as if she wasn't sure how far we were both willing to go. She undressed slowly, her movements soft and deliberate. I watched her, my heart racing as I took in the sight of her, so familiar, yet so distant. When I moved toward her, she didn't pull away. Instead, she kissed me again, this time with more intensity. It was a kiss full of longing, full of regret, but also something deeper, a desire to rediscover what we once had. Her hands roamed across my body, tracing the familiar lines of muscle and skin, and I couldn't help but respond. The tension that had built up between us finally began to dissolve. Her touch was gentle, but with an underlying urgency that mirrored my own. As our bodies pressed closer, every movement seemed like a promise that we would rebuild, that we could somehow find a way back to each other. I kissed her neck, feeling the warmth of her skin beneath my lips. She gasped softly, her fingers tangling in my hair, pulling me closer. But even as we allowed ourselves to be lost in each other, there was an underlying sadness. The hurt was still there, buried beneath the surface, but we both knew it wasn't something we could ignore. Still, in that moment, in the heat of our passion, it felt like we were trying to reclaim something we thought we had lost forever. As we moved together, the lines between love and pain blurred. We were both searching for something, for closure, for forgiveness, for a second chance. And as the night wore on, as we gave in to the intimacy we once shared, it felt like we were trying to heal what had been broken, one kiss at a time. The next morning, we lay in bed together, our bodies tangled beneath the sheets. The room was quiet, save for the sound of our breathing. I could feel her warmth beside me, but I also felt a certain heaviness in the air. It wasn't over. It couldn't be. We had crossed a line, and I knew things couldn't go back to the way they were, but I also knew that the path ahead wouldn't be easy. We couldn't pretend like everything was fixed. The trust had been shattered, and the betrayal would never be completely forgotten. But maybe, just maybe, we could rebuild, slowly, one step at a time. Sophie turned toward me, her eyes full of uncertainty, but also hope. "I'm sorry," she whispered again, her voice hoarse. "I never meant to hurt you." I know, I replied, running my fingers through her hair. But we can't just erase the past. We have to face it. And as we lay there, I realized that even if we couldn't change the past, we had the power to decide what came next. It wasn't going to be easy, but we could try. The days that followed were a blur. Sophie and I had crossed a line. It was clear that the physical intimacy we had shared had opened a door we couldn't easily close. We had come together seeking comfort and connection, but it hadn't fixed anything. The problems that had lingered in our marriage, the secrets, the lies, none of that had been erased in the heat of the moment. Sophie tried to act like things were normal. She made breakfast the next morning, her smile still faint but trying to mask the tension between us. She tried to kiss me goodbye, but I pulled away, unable to shake the feeling of betrayal that still lingered inside me. "Are you still going to see him?" I asked her one night, the question hanging in the air between us like a ticking bomb. Sophie froze, her hand resting on the edge of the kitchen counter, her back to me. She didn't answer at first. Her silence was louder than any response. "I don't know," she finally said, her voice small. "I don't know if I'm ready to end it with Mark. He's been there for me in ways you haven't been lately." Her words hit me like a physical blow. I had known it, I had suspected it, but hearing her say it out loud made the truth even more painful. She was still holding on to him, still keeping that connection alive. She wasn't really choosing me. She was choosing the comfort of the familiarity she had built with him. I took a step closer, my voice shaking with a mix of rage and hurt. "So, you're telling me, after everything we've been through, you still want him? You're still clinging to him?" Sophie started to speak, but I cut her off. "You don't get to make excuses anymore. You've been lying to me for months. You've been lying to both of us. You think I didn't know what was happening, what you were doing? I saw the way you looked at him. I saw the way he touched you at that damn restaurant." Sophie turned to face me, her face flushed with a mix of guilt and anger. "You think I wanted this? You think I wanted to hurt you?" Her voice cracked, but there was something else in her eyes. Something dark. I was lonely in a way I couldn't tell you. I needed someone to see me. I needed someone who made me feel wanted, like I wasn't just existing. I didn't know what to say. The words she was throwing at me cut deeper than I thought possible. She had been lonely? How could she have been lonely with me after everything we had built together? We were partners. We were supposed to face everything together. And yet she had turned to him. I stepped back, my chest tightening. "You should have told me that," I said quietly. "Instead, you pushed me away. You turned your back on us." "I didn't want to hurt you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never wanted to hurt you, but I didn't know how to make it stop. I didn't know how to make it go away, the emptiness I felt. It was inevitable. I couldn't live in this state of limbo any longer, the lies, the confusion, the hurt. It was eating me alive. I needed closure. I needed to confront him. Mark, the man who had taken my place. The man Sophie had turned to when she felt alone. I didn't tell Sophie I was going to meet him. She knew something was coming, but she didn't know when or how it would happen. Part of me wanted to confront her first, to get the truth from her once and for all. But I needed to understand him. Why? What was it about him that Sophie had found so alluring, so irresistible? What had made him worth betraying everything we had? I waited outside his apartment building, my heart pounding. I knew this was a dangerous game. I wasn't sure what would happen next, but I had to face him. He had been with my wife, and now I was about to face him. The confrontation was inevitable. When Mark finally opened the door, he seemed surprised to see me standing there. His eyes flickered with recognition. followed by something else. Something I couldn't quite place. His face hardened quickly, and I could see the tension in his posture. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice guarded. "You," I said, my words sharp. "I want to know why. Why her? What made you think it was okay to take my wife? To lie to me? To play this game?" Mark stepped back, his eyes narrowing. "You think I wanted to hurt you?" he asked, a hint of disbelief in his voice. "I didn't plan this. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. But things with Sophie—" He paused, looking away as though struggling to find the right words. "It's complicated." "Complicated?" I repeated, my voice rising with anger. "You knew she was married. You knew what this would do to me. And you did it anyway. You let it go too far." He sighed, rubbing his forehead. "I never meant to hurt you, man. But I can't apologize for something that was already happening before I stepped in. You need to talk to her. She's the one who wanted this." The words stung, but I wasn't done. I needed to hear him admit it. I needed to hear him say what had been going on behind my back. "Did you love her?" I demanded. "Was it worth it?" Mark hesitated, his eyes flickering with something I couldn't read. Finally, he spoke. "I don't know. I can't say I loved her like you did, but there was something there, something that pulled us both in." I clenched my fists. "You think that makes it okay?" He didn't answer. He simply stood there looking at me with a mixture of guilt and indifference. It was like he had already moved on, like he had already justified it in his own mind. But I hadn't. I couldn't. The next few days were the hardest of my life. I didn't know where Sophie and I stood anymore. The confrontation with Mark had done nothing to ease the pain. It had only made it worse. I felt like I was drowning in a sea of lies, and every attempt to swim to the surface only pulled me deeper. Sophie knew something had changed. She could see it in my eyes, in the way I barely spoke to her. She tried to reach out, tried to explain herself, but it felt like every word she spoke only pushed me farther away. "I'm sorry," she said one night, sitting across from me at the kitchen table, her eyes brimming with tears. "I never meant to hurt you like this, but I'm so lost I don't know how to fix what's broken." I stared at her, my heart heavy with doubt. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I whispered. "I don't know if I can trust you again." The silence between us felt unbearable. The love we had once shared felt like a distant memory, slipping away as the weeks dragged on. There was a part of me that still loved her, but there was another part that knew things could never go back to the way they were. Too much had happened. Too many things had been said. Too many boundaries crossed. "I don't want to lose you," she said, her voice breaking. "But I understand if you can't forgive me. I don't know if I can forgive myself." Days passed, but the weight of the situation only grew heavier. Sophie and I didn't speak much. It wasn't just the distance. It was the silence, the suffocating awareness of what had happened between us. She had betrayed me, and I had let it happen, but I could no longer ignore the truth. Our relationship was broken beyond repair. I couldn't bring myself to look at her without remembering everything she had done. Every lie, every touch she had shared with Mark, and every moment she had kept from me. There was no forgiveness left in me. Not for her, not for us. Sophie came home late one evening. I was sitting on the couch, staring at the darkened windows, thinking about everything. I had spent so many nights replaying the past, wondering if I had missed the signs, blaming myself for being so blind. But this time, as she walked into the room, I didn't feel the familiar pull to her. I didn't feel the longing, the desire to fix things. She stood in the doorway, watching me, waiting for me to say something, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. My silence, though, spoke louder than any words. "Name, we need to talk," she said softly, her voice trembling. I didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her presence. What more is there to say? I asked, my voice low and cold. You've already said everything. And I've seen everything I needed to see. She walked toward me, her steps hesitant. I didn't want to lose you. I thought I could keep everything separate. I didn't mean for things to get out of hand. I finally turned to face her, my heart heavy with the realization of just how much had been broken. But you did, Sophie. You didn't just make a mistake. You chose him. You chose someone else over me. Her eyes filled with tears, but they didn't move me anymore. The trust was gone. The love we once shared had been tainted by her actions, and I couldn't unsee it. I thought you loved me, I said quietly, the pain laced in every word. But I was wrong. You wanted something else, something I couldn't give you. Sophie reached for me, but I pulled away instinctively. The touch of her hand, once so familiar, now felt foreign. Don't, I said, the words coming out more forcefully than I intended. Don't touch me. She recoiled, her face crumpling with the hurt of my rejection. But I couldn't care. I couldn't go back. I had to protect myself, even if it meant walking away from everything we had built together. I don't know who you are anymore, I said, my voice thick with emotion. The woman I loved is gone, and I don't want to keep pretending she's still here. The silence between us stretched longer than I ever thought possible. I could feel her pain, her regret, but I no longer felt sympathy. Not when I realized that everything she had promised me had been a lie. I'm sorry, she whispered, the tears streaming down her face. I never wanted to hurt you. I never meant to. But I didn't want to hear it anymore. I didn't want to hear any more excuses. I had been living in the shadow of her infidelity for too long. And I couldn't do it any longer. And there's one... I stood up, walking past her, not once looking back. I think it's time you leave, I said quietly. This isn't our home anymore. Sophie didn't protest. She didn't fight it. She just stood there, broken, as I walked out of the room. The next few days were a blur. Sophie packed her things, but she didn't say anything. The tension between us had finally reached its breaking point, and neither of us had the words to fix it. She had betrayed me, and I had no interest in finding forgiveness anymore. When she left, there was no drama, no shouting. She simply took her bags and walked out the door. And as I stood there, watching her leave, I realized just how much I had changed. I wasn't angry anymore. I was relieved. The emptiness in the house felt different now. It wasn't just the silence of a broken relationship. It was the absence of someone who had once meant everything to me and now meant nothing. The next few days were a kind of quiet freedom. I spent hours alone, reflecting on everything. I wasn't heartbroken anymore. I wasn't consumed with sadness. What I felt was something much colder: clarity. I no longer needed Sophie. I no longer needed the life we had built. I moved on, slowly but surely. At first, it felt like a betrayal to myself. How could I just let go of someone I had loved for so long? But then I realized it wasn't a betrayal. It was self-preservation. I had been suffocating in the lies, the betrayal, and I couldn't stay in that place anymore. As the weeks went on, I focused on myself. I spent time with friends who had always been there for me, people who never let me down. I threw myself into work, into hobbies I had neglected. I started to feel alive again, in a way I hadn't in years. Sophie tried to contact me a few times. She sent messages, apologies, pleas for forgiveness, but I didn't respond. It wasn't because I was angry, at least not anymore. It was because I didn't need her anymore. I didn't need the past we shared. I was ready to move on. And slowly I started to find peace, not in forgiveness, not in reconciliation, but in knowing that I could walk away from it all and rebuild. The person I had been in that marriage was gone, but the person I was becoming was stronger. And I realized something important. I didn't need her to complete me. I never had. Months passed, and life continued. There were still moments of doubt, moments when the memories of what I had once believed were happy times would creep in. But those moments were fewer now. I had learned to live with the pain, to let go of what couldn't be fixed. I started dating again, tentatively at first, but with a new understanding of what I wanted, and I didn't need to chase the ghosts of the past to find it. Sophie remained a part of my past, a chapter that I had closed. I didn't hate her. I didn't feel bitterness or anger anymore. I simply knew that we were no longer part of each other's story. And that was enough.